But anyway, thanks for joining me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about a game that we developed, and by we, I mean a team of about 20 people who I will go through towards the presentation, and a collaboration between the University of Wisconsin and the Massachusetts Audubon Society, with funding from the National Science Foundation. And the game is called iPlan. Essentially, the idea behind iPlan is that we wanted to take yeah, okay. Was to take sort of real world planning practices and make them accessible for students, in particular, sort of high school aged high school students or adults. So I just want to give you a quick overview of the game. Play a video, 2 minutes long, a little bit less, just to give you kind of the overview. And then what I'm going to do is sort of step through some of the design principles that we had when we put it together to give you a little more detail about how we did it. And then, like I said, sort of at the end, we'll have some time if you wanted to play around with the system, ask questions, that kind of thing. Tested this just a minute ago. It's working. Oh, there we go.
Interactive map that lets players see how much changes in land use affect those issues. For example, restoring wetlands in former industrial areas can lower greenhouse gas emissions and pollution, but it also decreases jobs. And changing from high-density apartments to single-family homes reduces housing availability, but expands habitats for birds. Because land use planning is a civic process, players submit proposed changes to simulated community stakeholders for feedback. Stakeholders have different and sometimes conflicting interests, so players are challenged to develop plans that satisfy as many people as possible. To determine how much change each stakeholder wants, players submit different proposals to identify more precise targets for community improvement. Players submit a final proposal when they think they have addressed as many stakeholder concerns as possible. iPlan brings real-world planning practices to mobile devices, allowing players to solve complex land use problems in their own neighborhoods or anywhere in the contiguous United States.
So it just gives you a very quick, very quick overview of the system. And so I just want to talk a little bit about some of the design principles that went into this and how we kind of built this version. So the first one was accessibility. We really wanted this to be a system that was easy for people to use, and particularly easy for teachers to use in a classroom context or in any other educational context that they might care about. And so we made it a web-based game. Right? It's not something you have to download through an app store. It's not something that like requires any special installation or anything like that. It works in a browser. You pull up Firefox, you pull up Chrome, you go to the website, and you're off to the races. We also wanted to make sure that it worked on any kind of device, smartphones, tablets, Chromebooks, and laptops, right? So it couldn't have any specific screen real estate requirements. It couldn't have any specific sort of higher technical requirements like a Chromebook had to be able to kind of do the processing, and it had to be sort of fast and easy, because we wanted this to be something you could do anywhere, literally anywhere, anywhere you could get internet, basically. And so that turned out to be very useful during COVID, because everybody had to pivot to remote all of a sudden, and so that it would work on any device and that you could kind of use it how you wanted turned out to be a real advantage in many ways. We also built it on the Google Maps platform, right? So the idea was that people mostly already understand how to use Google Maps. They know how to pan, they know how to zoom in and out, they know how to recenter, they know how to do a lot of the things that Google Maps allow you to do when you're thinking about a sort of map interface for a game. And so basically we layered everything on top of that interface, because we figured that would be sort of, again, a very low barrier to use for not only students, but also for teachers to learn. So the second thing that we really emphasized was localizability. We really wanted this to be something that you could do kind of anywhere, sort of within reason. So we didn't want to design a game that was sort of set in far, far away. Rather, we wanted it to be something that kids were doing or adults were doing in their own community or could do in their own community if they wanted to. And this was really based on experiences that we had working with teachers and students who used an early version of a land use planning game that had one location, which was Lowell, Massachusetts. Chosen in part because our partners in Mass Audubon thought that would be a really good site. And we realized that, like, for kids that knew about Lowell and were familiar with it, it worked really great. And for kids who weren't, they were like, it's just a game, right? I don't know, whatever. Might as well have been far, far away. Even if they lived somewhere nearby. I love this kid who's like, well, if it was Dorchester or Roxbury, then maybe I might have cared about it. But like, well, who cares? Like, so we, this was, talking to teachers, right, who are like, well, I don't know much about Lowell, like if they weren't, and even some of the Massachusetts teachers are like, I know where it is. But certainly teachers outside of Massachusetts were like, didn't really have any connection to it. And so we realized that we really needed to be able to make this something that teachers could choose a location that they knew something about, that their students knew something about, even if it wasn't their own location, but somewhere they had some control over that. So if you wanted to be able to create a map in Winter, South Dakota, you should be able to do that. Charleston, Through the Consequences, New Mexico, Muscle Shoals, Alabama, Portland, Maine, wherever, wherever it was you wanted to create, Area 51, is it a foreign map or is it? You had to be able to kind of pick any location you wanted, and even Madison, Wisconsin, where I live. And that was really important, but it was also important that these maps that got created were actually reasonable maps of those locations, right? They couldn't just be like, okay, well, we're going to slap some land uses over, the map of where you live. Those actually had to have, a reasonable amount of sort of authenticity to it. So that was sort of the third thing that we really cared about. And part of this is because if you tell people you're making a game about land use and planning, the first thing they think is SimCity, right? Everybody is familiar with SimCity. Everybody. And SimCity is great. It's a really fun game, but it's also a God game, and there's things like fire-breathing lizards that come through, and we really wanted to make sure there were no fire-breathing lizards in this game, because the whole point was to take something that is a civic process, a real process that people do, and make that accessible to kids who often have no concept of how land use planning happens, no concept that they themselves could go to a town meeting and have input on land use decisions and land use management, who don't actually understand civic processes because civics have been cut from their curriculum. So it was really important to us that this, although it is a game, that it feel like something that was helping kids and adults even understand more about a really important process that affects their lives. And so we wanted to avoid anything that might make it feel make believe, right? Or that might make it feel like they could just do whatever they wanted. So this affected everything from the kinds of issues that we included, to the like I said, the ways that the maps reflect local land uses. To the ways that we modeled the community stakeholders, and this was one of those places where we didn't necessarily want to model things the way they are, because if that were the case, then these would be mostly old white guys and women. We wanted to model the way things should be, which was having a wide range of community stakeholders engaging in land use processes. We wanted kids to see that anybody could show up. It could be a construction worker, it could be a pediatrician, it could be an environmentalist, it could be a business owner, it didn't matter. But that there are sort of blocks of people in the world. Right? There are business consortia, there are things like the Chamber of Commerce, right? There are environmental activists, there are sort of community or neighborhood associations, and those tend to be groups that have a lot of power in land use decisions. And so we kind of split the difference there. We sort of gave them a sense of like, yep, yeah, you're not going to get any land use management, land use change done without overcoming the business folks, right? Like they're going to be in that conversation. But we also wanted to make it clear that like literally anybody can be in that conversation, including them. And I can say a little bit more later about some of the ways that teachers have sort of helped kids see that in really cool ways. And so we went, pretty deep into, creating a sort of bio for all the different stakeholders, and, sort of coming up with ways of modeling the preferences that they would have on different issues, which is kind of tricky in a game that has to cover the entirety of the contiguous United States, and all these different issues, like figuring out ways for the stakeholders to kind of talk about those that didn't involve us writing like thousands and thousands of lines of feedback and that kind of thing is a real challenge. I can talk about it a little bit more later. But anyway, the whole idea of all of this was that it should feel like an actual planning process. It should feel like the tools that they're using, the ways that they're thinking about it, and the ways they interact with the stakeholders are realistic, but also aspirational. The related criterion that we had was fidelity. It was really important to us that all of the things that happen in this system are as realistic as we can make them given the constraints. And that fidelity we often called truthiness, right? The idea was like, of course, the models that we're creating are not the kind of models that like actual land use planner uses. For one thing, our scale is totally different and that kind of thing, but if they had to sort of feel like them. They had to have the kind of same goals that those models have and that sort of thing. And so, in technical literature, this is called a reduced form model. Right? A reduced form model is something that captures a high percentage of the accuracy of the model, but using a much simpler computations, simpler visualizations, that kind of thing. So that's really what we were going for here. It was something that got like 90-95% of what's happening. That extra 5 to 10%, professionals really care about that. That's really critical. But from an educational perspective, for a teenager, for an adult who's not, who's not a land use planner, most of that doesn't matter. And so we were able to kind of capture the core pieces. So that meant from the start, right, when someone creates a map and they see like that, this area is commercial, and this area is high density residential, and this area is recreational, and this area is limited use, and whatever. That had to actually pass a sniff test. It doesn't have to be perfect, but someone can't look at a map and go like, well, wait, where my house is, it says is like an industrial area. There's no industry around me. Like, it couldn't have that sense of like, being kind of completely off base. So to do that, we actually took raster data for the entire country. So every pixel here is basically 60 by 60 meters. And basically that data covers a wide range of land uses. We had to consolidate the land uses because we didn't want to have students trying to sort through 25 different land uses. Most of the differences didn't matter in a lot of them, again, for their purposes. So we got that down to 10. But we also then had to figure out, okay, well, like this is way too granular for the kinds of things we wanted. This is the kind of thing that actual planners do because they're working on like a single block or, a couple of blocks or a corridor. That was too narrow in scope for what you would want to do with a high school student. We wanted them to be able to do like a whole neighborhood or even a whole city if they wanted to. And so we had to turn this kind of data into this kind of data. In other words, we had to take it and pull it up to a higher granularity without sacrificing most of the accuracy. And so we had to design an optimization that basically took this really fine-grained data and basically took census boundaries, so census blocks, and figured out how to basically merge these raster level parcels into larger groups that still had sensible boundaries, right? Because you didn't also want to merge two things that were the same land use, but kind of were in like literally on opposite sides of the tracks sort of thing. And so you wanted to kind of keep some sensible boundaries. And so that was a problem we spent the better part of a year figuring out, but we made it so that, we could basically do this kind of on the fly. We constructed layers that are at specific granularities, but then when someone in the game says, I want a map of this area, it basically takes, whatever the nearest layer is, and then it figures out how to get it to about the same number of parcels, which is 200. So and when you develop a map, you're always going to get 200 parcels, no matter what size, area you do. And the reason for that is it's a good level of cognitive complexity. Sort of figured empirically, like there's enough going on that it doesn't get overly simplified, but it's not so overwhelming that you can't figure out kind of, where to even begin with it. And again, we were thinking about like if you were doing this on a tiny iPhone versus on a laptop, it had to kind of work at all those levels. So that was one way. The second case where we really cared about fidelity was in the actual modeling. So when I change, industrial into housing, and I want to know how that affects greenhouse gas emissions, that has to be reasonably accurate. It doesn't have to be perfect. The directionality has to be right. The magnitude has to be approximately right. And so we spent a lot of time also figuring out for every possible land use, what was its contribution to these different things, which meant finding data, figuring out how to translate it into again, like a reduced form model, and also choosing indicators that are predominantly affected by land use. So for example, with greenhouse gas emissions, we explicitly did it as emissions because greenhouse gas levels are affected by all sorts of things, meteorological, climatological, and so on, and may have nothing to do with your local area. You may be getting greenhouse gas emissions from something 200 miles away or 1,000 miles away even. And so we thought very carefully about what are things that really are affected primarily by land use. So you don't need a whole lot of other information to know what's happening. So these are the ones that we came up with for our sort of initial push. We have a few others that we are hoping to develop at some point, but it turns out a lot are very hard. They're just most things are not affected only by land use, and even most of these, we're hedging a little bit. And a lot of this matters because in the game there are resources that describe, for example, the land uses and indicators, and so when a teacher or a student chooses the indicators and then they go into their map and they pick a parcel and they change it to something else, like in this case, changing commercial into conservation land, and all of these things up at the top all change, that has to make sense. It has to sort of make sense from not only an intuitive understanding of how those things work, but when it's not intuitive, a teacher has to be able to explain, like, why is that happening? Oh, why did birds go up when you added, low density housing? It turns out low density housing is actually a pretty good environment for bird populations. Okay, so the last one that I want to emphasize was teachability, and this is Stephen and I were talking about a little bit earlier, is that although this is a game that's just out there in the world, anybody can use it. We sort of optimized it around high school classrooms. We sort of thought, okay, well, that's probably where we're going to see a lot of use. It's a really good target demographic. High school kids are mature enough to do something that's complicated, essentially, but they're also at a good age for learning how to get engaged in things like land use planning. And so we had a few basic things. One was time. It couldn't take too much time because teachers already have crowded curricula. It couldn't be too much of a lift. Couldn't be too Sisyphean for either teachers or students. It couldn't cost money, or at least couldn't cost very much money. It couldn't have difficult technical requirements, especially screen real estate requirements. And there had to be levers that a teacher could pull in order to make it a part of their curriculum, in order for them to have some ownership over how it worked and how they used it. So we made it so that you could do this in almost as little time as you want. You could do this as a half-hour exercise. You could do it as an hour, as a 2-hour exercise. You break it up over a few days, do it all in one shot. So that was sort of a good amount of time flexibility. We made it so that it was more like pushing a boulder on the flats rather than pushing it up the hill, which is still hard. We wanted it to be challenging. It's supposed to make people think, but not to be so hard that people rage quit it or just get too frustrated. We wanted to keep the cost very low, and as it turns out, we were able to keep it free essentially, and we hope to continue doing that. Now it's just up on the web. This version certainly will be, and Everybody can use it anytime they want, anytime they want. As I already mentioned, we made it possible to play on literally any device that gets the internet. We haven't tested literally any device, but so far we haven't run across one that won't play it. And we made a bunch of levers that teachers could pull. So localization is obviously the big one. You can pick any location, more or less any scale. If you go too big, the maps get a little goofy, right? You can make a map of a whole state, but then you get entire cities that are one land use kind of thing. So it gets a little goofy. But there are reasons that you might want to do that. Obviously, if you go super, super tiny, it can be hard because it can't actually generate the 200 parcels. So it'll tell you just need to go bigger essentially. But there's other levers. There's a difficulty lever, which I can say more about, but I'll hold off on the first time. And obviously, you can choose the indicators that you want to include and that sort of thing. So this made it so that teachers, whatever they were teaching, could integrate something like this into the curriculum. And a lot have. So it's been used in a lot of science classes. It's been used in civics, kinds of contexts in those cases where schools have civics. And a whole bunch of other contexts, and in both schools and in informal education. So as I mentioned, this took an enormous team to put together. I don't even know if this is entirely a complete list. I'm pretty sure it is. We had, geospatial experts. We had people who are experts in environmental modeling. We had, people who are experts in education and in game design. We had a number of students that were involved, both undergraduate and graduate students. We had optimization experts because there was a bunch of places where we needed to do fairly complex math to get this to sort of work, essentially. And so, this was only possible because we had a fairly large grant from NSF and because we were able to excite a bunch of people about doing this kind of work. And so that's what ultimately generated the game, which you can access directly at app.iplan.us, or you can just go to iplan.us if you want to just see the website and learn a little bit more. And there's, as you can see in the upper right there's a page for educators that has some sample curricula that teachers have put together. There's not things that we designed, but that actual teachers have done and that kind of thing. We need to do some updates on the site because there's a bunch of new content we need to add, but that's basically the system. I'm not sure exactly how much time we have because I know we started late, but
10, 15 minutes.
great. So if we want to take the last 10, 15 minutes, you guys are welcome to pull it up and play. I'm also happy to just pull it up on here if you guys want to do it as a group. Or if you just have questions about the design process or about kind of what we've done with it so far. I know I didn't really talk much about the sort of outcomes, which we're still working on some level. This was a game that we had sort of planned to finish in 2020, which, as you can imagine, created all sorts of problems for us. And so I ended up taking a little longer, and that meant that we didn't have as much time to do a lot of the sort of research, implementation research, because it was also really hard for teachers to do anything during COVID, basically, especially when things were mostly remote. So a lot of them were using it, but we couldn't get time with them. They couldn't sort of do a lot of the things we planned to do. But we have some information, about sort of how it's been used and how it's worked as a learning tool. But that's everything there. So again, happy if you guys want to play around with it. Also happy to just answer questions at this point. Whatever you guys want to do is fine with me.
Thank you. Actually, I had a question. So Josh is one of my former students who is developing a card-based game for urban planning, city planning.
Okay.
So one of the things that I've talked a little bit about, and I think we'll be talking about tomorrow, is the challenges of maintaining that fidelity to the way the world actually works. Because obviously these are very complex systems that have many, many overlapping parts. And one of the things that we focus on with respect to Sims like SimCity or city skylines or that sort of thing, they make a lot of these decisions that are not fidelitous because it helps the game be playable as a game. So SimCity makes the assumption that putting a police station on every corner makes the world safer. That's just not true. So, and obviously you're doing a very different kind of thing where you're not actually placing individual kinds of institutions or organizations on the street corner. But I'm kind of curious, how do you think through as a team those methods of fidelity? And how do you decide what fits in one category or another and how those affect one? I know you said you have a lot of experts. I'm curious what the interactions between them look like.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that guide those conversations. So one of them is, and I'll say like my background, my PhD is in history, and so in some ways, like I come at something like this very trepidatious because I'm very well aware of all of the ways that land use in particular is a kind of fraught topic, both because of the way that has been acquired historically, but also in the ways that it's been leveraged as a tool of control. So a lot of what we were doing was actually doing our best to avoid things like that. So like your mother is like a not indicator.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah.
Like we really tried to think very carefully about how we were representing the way that land use affects different aspects of things that people care about, which obviously there's assumptions baked in all of that, right? We're assuming, for example, that industry generates a ton of greenhouse gases because we're basing that on data on what industry has done so far, but that doesn't mean that's the only way it could be. So one of the challenges is that this is not an imagination game. This isn't how do you make industry better, or how do you figure out new ways to to organize societies. This is about like how things currently work and what does that mean. So that's sort of one side of this. The other piece, though, is that you'll notice, right, in this game, it doesn't really matter which parcel you choose. It's really just how big is it and what thing is it changing from. Which, to my mind, is a huge limitation. Like, I think we should be getting kids to think like, oh yeah, but like that's a neighborhood that's predominantly low income. So changing that parcel is actually different than changing this other parcel that's predominantly high income. For example. There was only something we could do in the initial version, and so we just had to accept that there were things that have to get on the way for getting more funding, essentially. And that's sort of high on the list. It's two guys things on the list for kind of the next one, the other one being future modeling climate change. Because this is a point system too, and it just assumes that the change happens instantly, and what would happen right now if just magically where it line nothing. The other piece of this, I think, is we wanted kids to understand sort of some of those basic scientific relationships, right? Like, if you are putting in high density housing, it actually does increase greenhouse gas emissions by land use, right? Even though per capita it's lower, but this is a land use game. Like, the point is to understand land use. So yeah, it'll help a lot with sort of population and housing, but it also does per square foot, right? You're going to get a lot. We wanted them to understand that, but the sort of the stealthier part of this is that the most important thing that we want kids to get out of this is just to see that like there are people in the world who have opinions, that people listen to those opinions. Right? So those stakeholders, right? The stakeholders who are sort of the bosses, right? And sort of this game, the people that you're trying to win over. We actually want the students to see themselves in that role, even though they're taking on the role of trying to win them over, taking on the role of a planner. But at the end of the day, we actually want them to come out and think, sure, we want them to think, yeah, I'm going to be a land planner, great. But like, most of them are not going to do that right. We want most of them to come out thinking like, oh yeah, I could be Damien, or oh yeah, I could be Ezra, or oh yeah, I could be, Clarice or whatever, right? Who's just showing up and being like, I don't like this plan, that's not good for birds, or I don't like this plan because there's not enough housing, or whatever. And that someone listens to them. And in some ways, the best sort of feedback we've gotten from teachers is that that's working. That they're able to have conversations with students about, like this town has a planning commission, they have meetings, like anybody can go, they're public by rule, right? We had one teacher who had their students go and present iPlan plans to their local planning board about an actual planning process that was going on. The board was just like floored. Didn't show up, let alone multiple high school students show up to one of these meetings, right? Like that kind of thing. And so, I think those are sort of all considerations in that particular, that particular process. But again, you do have to be willing to make some trade-offs. There are just a lot of things the system doesn't do. Transportation is not imperial notice. We just ignore transportation because it's too hard. For something like this, it just is way too complicated. You have to build a whole system just to deal with transportation, essentially. Adjacency is not part of this. It doesn't matter if you put industrial next to housing or industrial next to wetlands. In the real world, that matters a lot, but in this game, it doesn't because, again, it's just too much. There's only so much we can expect a high school student or adult even who, doesn't do this kind of stuff day in, day out to kind of hold in their head. There's only so many things we can teach them through the game. So we had to make some very, very early decisions about like, no, these are like the three things we want people to get from this. And everything else is important, but those are the ones that we're going to be able to accomplish. Yeah.
You mentioned.
Yep.
Land area. And what was option?
Yeah, so the biggest ones are also location, obviously. Like you choose a location, and that includes choosing the scope. And the way that works basically is that like whatever's on your screen in that map interface is what the map will get made of. So you can zoom and expand and everything. Whatever you frame on your screen, whatever your screen is, that's approximately what the area will be. So that's sort of one. Second lever is obviously the indicators. Like you can only choose from what's on the list, but you can choose any 5 you want, as long as there's at least one in each category. And that's probably to set tension, because a lot of times the social and environmental ones are in conflict, and so it guarantees that there'll be some tension there. There's a third one, which is a difficulty setting, and essentially the difficulty in this kind of game is determined by how hard it is to satisfy the stakeholder. So in this version, what we do is we do an optimization. So we take whatever the starting map is, the indicators that we choose, and we figure out where all the stakeholders' thresholds are for those indicators. They care about birds, like how many more birds do they want, or how many fewer birds do they want, or 8 birds. Yeah, exactly. So that, we basically give it a distribution that's based on sort of randomly generating solutions to that specific map. And saying, okay, well, like, how easy should it be to satisfy its stakeholder settings? Get that distribution. But teachers can also choose how often do you get to query the stakeholders. The only way that students really know what stakeholders want is they submit plans to them and they get feedback back. And this actually works in the real world. They're called stated preference surveys. The planner will come up with a few different plans. And they'll say, okay, like you, the public, you tell us what you like and don't like about these plans. Which one do you like best? Which one do you not like? Which one do you like worse than one? So that's essentially what they do. They come up with a scenario. They submit it to one or more of the stakeholders. And then they get feedback. So we basically just control how many feedback opportunities they get. So essentially each stakeholder counts as one, and so there's 3 different settings. So the easy setting is get more opportunities to ask the stakeholders for feedback, and then the hard setting they get the fewest videos. So that's also a time control. Right? So yeah, fewer requests is harder, but it's also faster. Right? So if the teacher really wants this to be done in an hour, they put it on the hard setting and you say, well, just do the best you can, and 15 requests. I forget what numbers are more than everything, but and that kind of thing. And so that's also a lever that they can pull. Those are the only ones as of right now, although, again, teachers have started to write wrapper curricula for these simulations. As you'll notice that, like, this doesn't really have, except for, like, resources on, like, what are the land uses, what are the indicators, and like, it doesn't have a lot of curriculum built into it. It's meant to be kind of a sandbox. And so, because of that, teachers sort of figure out that was by design, but then that, a lot of teachers have been willing to show that back out. Allows them to because they wasn't able to control that much of how it works. And when do you want me to stop? Doesn't matter.
Whenever people meet her in, I think that's the center for this room area, so
Okay.
you can have questions or whatever.
Yeah, so I'm happy to take other questions. Well, thank you guys for coming. I appreciate it.